The letter that changed Elsie Rademacher's life was 4 sentences long, and not one of them contained the word love. She was 18 years old the morning she read it, standing in the cold hallway of a boarding house in St. Joseph, Missouri, with her coat still buttoned and her breath showing white in the air. The paper was cheap. The handwriting was square and careful, the way a man writes when he does not write often and wants to be understood. I have a house and 2 children. I am told you are willing. The fare is enclosed. I will meet the train. That was all. No promises, no pretty words, just a train fare folded inside a plain envelope, and a name at the bottom, Silas Bray. Elsie read it 3 times. Then she folded it into her palm and held it there until the paper went warm, because it was the first thing in 2 years that anybody had sent her on purpose. Remember that detail. It matters more than anything else you'll hear today. The girl nobody was waiting for. Elsie's parents had both passed the winter she turned 16. Quietly, within 4 months of each other, the way long married people sometimes go. She had been left with a trunk, a good coat, and an uncle in Missouri, who took her in the way a man takes in a stray cat. He did not put her out, and he did not look at her either. For 2 years she worked. She scrubbed the boarding house floors on her knees. She carried coal. She learned to make a meal stretch and a stove behave and a room look cared for even when nobody in it cared. And every evening she sat on the narrow bed at the top of the stairs and listened to the sounds of other people's families through the floorboards. The arguments, the laughing, the ordinary noise of belonging. And she wondered what it would take to be part of a sound like that. When the boarding house mistress mentioned that a rancher out in Wyoming Territory had written asking after a decent girl willing to marry, Elsie did not hesitate the way you might expect an 18-year-old to hesitate. She asked one question, just one. Does he have children? The mistress blinked. 2. Twins, I believe. Their mother's been gone near 3 years. And Elsie said, then I'll go. Not because she wanted a husband. She was 18, and she had never been courted. And the idea of a stranger's ring on her finger frightened her the way deep water frightens a person who has never learned to swim. She said yes because of the children, because she knew, the way only a person who has been left knows, exactly what it feels like to be a child in a house where the caring has run out. 4 days west. The train took 4 days. Elsie spent them with her trunk under her feet and her hands folded in her lap, watching the country go from green to gold to something wide and pale and unfinished. Missouri had been crowded with trees. Wyoming was not crowded with anything. Just grass and sky, and now and then a smear of cattle so far off they looked like spilled pepper. She had $2.40 in her pocket, a change of clothes, her mother's thimble, and a photograph of a house she had never seen. Somewhere past Cheyenne, a woman across the aisle asked where she was headed. Cedar Bend, Elsie said. I'm to be married. The woman looked her over, the plain dress, the young face, the trunk with the broken latch tied shut with string, and said, not unkindly, do you know the man? No, ma'am. The woman was quiet a long moment. Then she reached into her basket and pressed a wrapped biscuit into Elsie's hands. Eat something before you get there, honey. Don't let him meet you hungry. Elsie ate half. She saved the rest. She would think about that biscuit for the rest of her life, because it was the last kindness she received before Cedar Bend, and because of what she ended up doing with the other half. The man at the platform. The Cedar Bend Depot was a single wooden building with a bench and a water barrel and a sign that had lost 2 letters. Silas Bray was 34 years old, and he was standing exactly where he said he would be. He was tall and weathered, and dressed in clothes that had been carefully brushed, which somehow made him look more nervous rather than less. He held his hat in both hands. When Elsie stepped down onto the platform, he looked at her. Really looked. One long, careful moment, and something moved across his face that she could not read at all. She would learn later what it was. It was grief, catching him sideways. Because he had been so busy arranging a life that he had forgotten he would have to stand there and watch a woman step off a train the way he had once watched another one. "Miss Rademacher," he said. "Yes, sir. You're young." "I'm 18, sir. I said so in the letter." "You did." He turned the hat around in his hands. "I'm not going to press you on anything. You should know that first. There's a room of your own. Door's got a latch on the inside. You use it or don't. That's your business, and nobody in my house will trouble you either way." Elsie had rehearsed 100 things to say on that train. Not one of them fit. So she just said, "Thank you," and picked up her own trunk before he could reach for it. And behind her, from the far end of the platform, came a small voice that stopped her cold. "Is that her?" The Tobias and Junie. They were 6 years old. Tobias and Junie Bray, twins, born 11 minutes apart, and they were standing beside the water barrel holding hands the way children hold hands when they've decided something in advance. Junie's braid had been done by a man who had clearly tried very hard and did not know how. Tobias's shirt was buttoned one hole off, top to bottom. They stared at Elsie. Elsie stared back. And then, without thinking about it at all, she crouched down in the dust of the platform in her only good dress, unwrapped the half biscuit she'd saved, broke it clean in two, and held out a piece to each of them. "I'm Elsie," she said. "I'm sorry it isn't bigger. It's what I've got." Junie took hers first. Tobias waited, the way a careful child does, until his sister had chewed and swallowed and nodded. Then he took his, and he did not eat it. He held it in his fist and looked up at her with his whole face open and said, "Are you staying?" 4 words. 6 years old. Elsie's throat closed so hard she could not answer for a moment. Behind her, she heard Silas Bray clear his throat and turn away, and she understood, without being told, that he had heard those 4 words before, from other visitors, and had watched his children ask them, and then watched the answer be, "No." "I'm staying," Elsie said. She had known the man for 90 seconds. She meant it anyway. The house. The Bray place sat 11 miles out, in a fold of grassland with a creek behind it and cottonwoods along the creek. 200 head of cattle, a barn that was better kept than the house, a kitchen with a good stove and no curtains. Elsie noticed everything a woman notices. The bread had been bought, not baked. There was no soap dish. The children's clothes were clean but mended by a man's hand. Big blunt stitches, done at night, done with love and no skill at all. That first night, she lay on a strange mattress in a strange house, 1,100 miles from anything she'd ever known, and listened to the wind come down off the grass, and she was so frightened she could feel her own heartbeat in her teeth. Then she heard something else. 2 sets of small, bare feet in the hallway. A whisper, a pause outside her door. They did not knock. They did not come in. They sat down against the wall in the dark, on the other side of her door, and stayed there. Elsie lay very still and cried without making a sound, not from fear anymore, but from the enormous, unbearable relief of being wanted by somebody. In the morning she got up before anyone, and she baked. Work. The word. It happened in 9 days. 9 days of Elsie learning where the flour was kept and how the stove drew and which floorboard creaked. 9 days of rebraiding Junie's hair every morning and buttoning Tobias's shirt straight and hearing them thunder down the stairs like a herd of small horses, because for the first time in 3 years there was somebody in that kitchen when they came down. She did not push. That was the thing about Elsie Rademacher. She never once said, "Call me anything." She just showed up. Every single morning she showed up. And on the 9th day, Junie came in from the yard with a skinned knee and tears standing in her eyes, and she ran the whole length of the kitchen and grabbed 2 fistfuls of Elsie's apron and said, "Mama, It hurts." The room went absolutely still. Tobias froze in the doorway. Silas Bray, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee halfway to his mouth, set it down so carefully that it did not make a sound. And Elsie, 18 years old, married to no one, in a house that was not hers, in a territory she'd been in for 9 days. Elsie knelt down and took the little girl's face in both hands and said, "I know, sweetheart. Let's go wash it." She did not correct her. Not then, not ever. Silas got up and walked outside. He stood by the corral fence for a long time with his hat in his hands, and Elsie watched him through the window and did not go to him, because some grief is a man's own to stand in. When he came back in, his eyes were red and his voice was steady. "They lost their mother young," he said. "I don't want them hurt again." "Neither do I," Elsie said. "That's not a promise a person can make." "No, sir," she agreed, "but it's one I intend to keep anyway." He looked at her a long moment, then he nodded once and went out to see to the cattle, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was not the end of anything else. Mrs. Adelaide Prine, Cedar Bend, had opinions about the Bray arrangement, and most of them lived in the front pew of the little clapboard church, in a black bombazine dress, under a hat with one gray feather. Adelaide Prine was 61 years old and had buried a husband and 2 grown sons, and had, somewhere along the way, decided that the correct response to a hard life was to hold everyone else to a very high standard. She stopped Elsie on the church steps the first Sunday. "You're the girl? Not a question. 18. Living out at Bray's?" "Yes, ma'am." "Unmarried?" "Yes, ma'am." "And those children calling you what they call you?" Adelaide's mouth thinned. "It isn't proper, and it isn't kind. Not to them. Children ought not be handed a mother who might leave by autumn." There it was, said out loud, on the church steps, in front of half the town. Elsie felt her face go hot. She was 18. She had no husband, no standing, no money, and no argument. So she did not make one. She said, "You're right that it would be cruel to leave them, ma'am." And then, quietly, "That's why I don't intend to." And she walked on into the church and sat down, and her hands shook through the entire first hymn. But here's what people in Cedar Bend noticed over the following months, whether they meant to or not. They noticed that when the Kessler family lost their hay barn, a young woman rode 11 miles with 3 loaves and a pot of beans and did not stay to be thanked. They noticed that the Bray twins came to school with their lunches wrapped in cloth and their collars flat and their hair done. They noticed that on Sundays there was always an extra pie on the table at the back of the church, and nobody ever saw who put it there, and it was always gone by the end. And they noticed something about Silas Bray, that he had started shaving on weekdays, that he walked different, that a man who had not laughed out loud in 3 years had been heard, in the mercantile, laughing at something his daughter said. Adelaide Prine noticed all of it, and said nothing, and disapproved on principle, until January. The storm. The blizzard came down the second week of January, and it came without much warning, the way they do. Adelaide Prine lived alone at the edge of town in a house with a bad chimney and a woodpile she had been meaning to have restacked since November. By the second day of the storm, the road was gone, the woodpile was under 4 feet of drift, and Adelaide Prine was sitting in her own parlor in every coat she owned, watching her breath, too proud to have told a single soul she needed anything. On the morning of the 3rd day, she heard something at her door. It was a young woman with snow to her knees and a scarf frozen stiff across her face, dragging a sled with an armload of split wood on it and a covered crock still warm in a wrapping of blankets. Elsie got the fire going before she said one word. Then she filled a bowl and set it in Adelaide Prine's hands and folded the old woman's stiff fingers around it. "How did you know?" Adelaide said. Her voice came out cracked. "Nobody's seen your smoke in 2 days, ma'am. Nobody in this town has thought about my smoke in 9 years. Well, Elsie fed another stick into the stove. "I have." Adelaide Prine, 61 years old, who had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had never once let a stranger see her cry, put her face down into her hands, and wept in front of an 18-year-old girl. Elsie stayed until the house was warm. She restacked the wood inside the door where an old woman could reach it. She swept the ash, and when she left, she said, "I'll come Thursday." And she did, and the Thursday after that, and every Thursday for the rest of Adelaide Prine's life. What was said in the spring? The following Sunday, Adelaide Prine stood up in the front of the church before the service began. Everyone assumed she was going to complain about something. She usually was. Instead, she said, "I said a hard thing to a young woman on these steps last spring. I said it in front of you all, so I'll unsay it in front of you all. I was wrong, and she has been better to this town than I have been in a decade." She sat down. She never mentioned it again. She did not need to. Cedar Bend had heard. Silas Bray heard it too, from the third row, sitting beside two children who were sitting beside a woman they had called Mama for the better part of a year. That afternoon he found Elsie on the porch shelling peas, with Tobias asleep against her shoulder. "Elsie," he said, and then he stopped, because he had not planned past her name. She waited. "I sent for a woman to keep a house," he said finally. "That's the plain truth of it, and I'm not proud of it. I thought if I could just hold things together until they were grown, that'd be enough. I never once thought about what I'd do if somebody came into this house and made it good." Again, Elsie kept shelling peas. Her hands were not steady. "Those children have called you Mama since the 9th day," Silas said. "I've called you nothing at all for a year, because I didn't have the right, and because I was afraid that if I said the word out loud, you'd remember you never chose any of this. You were 18 and you had nowhere to go." "I'm 19 now," Elsie said. "I know it. I know your birthday. Junie made you a paper crown." "She did." Silas turned his hat around in his hands. Same as the platform. Same nervous man. "I'm asking now," he said. "Not for a housekeeper. Not for the children. They've had you a year, and they'd have you forever regardless. I'm asking for me. I'd like you to be my wife, Elsie, and I'll wait however long you need to answer, and if the answer's no, you'll still have that room and that latch and everything else, for as long as you want it." Elsie set the bowl down. She was quiet a long moment, and what she was thinking about was a cold hallway in St. Joseph, and 4 sentences with no love in them, and a girl who had held a piece of paper until it went warm because it was the first thing anyone had sent her on purpose. "Mr. Bray," she said, "I've been home for a year. You're the last one to notice." Cedar Bend, 19 years later. They were married in June in the clapboard church, with Junie carrying the flowers and Tobias standing very straight beside his father, and Adelaide Prine in the second row weeping into a black-bordered handkerchief and insisting to everyone afterward that it was the pollen. There were 3 more children after that. There were good years and lean ones, a drought in '93 that nearly took the herd, a roof that came off in a windstorm, 1,000 ordinary mornings in a kitchen with curtains. Adelaide Prine passed peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1901, in a warm house with a full wood box by the door. Elsie had been there Thursday. And when Junie Bray was married herself, years later, and someone at the supper asked how her parents had met, she laughed and said the story wrong on purpose, the way families do. "Papa sent away for a housekeeper," she said, "and got a mother instead. Took him a whole year to work out which one he'd got." Because that is the truth of it, in the end. The world had told Elsie Rademacher, at 18, exactly what she was worth. A train fare and 4 sentences. 2 6-year-olds looked at her on a windy platform and told her something different. And they were right.